In a world that constantly demands our attention and presence, where social media has transformed solitude into a seemingly threatening experience, we find ourselves increasingly uncomfortable with being alone. Yet, throughout history, some of the greatest minds embraced solitude not as a punishment, but as a necessary path to profound insight and personal transformation. Among these thinkers, Friedrich Nietzsche stands as perhaps the most eloquent advocate for the power of solitude. The German philosopher, who lived from 1844 to 1900, developed a comprehensive understanding of how solitude serves not merely as an escape from society, but as the crucible in which greatness is forged. Today, we will explore Nietzsche's radical perspective on solitude, not as loneliness to be feared, but as a powerful state to be embraced by those who seek to transcend the ordinary and achieve true greatness. We will examine how Nietzsche's personal experiences shaped his philosophy, what he meant by solitude, and how his insights remain profoundly relevant in our hyper-connected modern world. To understand Nietzsche's philosophy of solitude, we must first understand the man himself. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a small town in Prussia. From an early age, he experienced profound isolation. After his father's death when Friedrich was only 4 years old, he grew up in a household dominated by women. His mother, sister, 2 aunts and grandmother, brilliant but often sickly, young Nietzsche found himself frequently separated from his peers. At school, despite his intellectual gifts, he never quite belonged. This early experience of being an outsider would later inform his philosophical outlook. As an adult, Nietzsche's life trajectory seemed initially conventional. He became the youngest professor of classical philology at the University of Basel at the remarkable age of 24. Yet, persistent health problems, including debilitating migraines, digestive issues, and deteriorating eyesight, eventually forced him to resign from this position in 1879. What followed was a decade of solitary wandering across Europe, primarily in Switzerland, France, and Italy. During these years of physical suffering and intellectual solitude, Nietzsche produced his most significant philosophical works. In a letter to his friend Franz Overbeck in 1883, Nietzsche wrote, "I have 43 years behind me, and am just as alone as I was as a child." This profound isolation was not merely circumstantial, but increasingly intentional. Nietzsche came to view his solitude as necessary for his philosophical work, as he wrote in Human, All Too Human. A certain inner self-sufficiency is necessary for freedom of the intellect. If you want to go your own way, never allow it to be blocked by those who still take offense at your solitude and can do nothing with you. Before delving deeper into Nietzsche's philosophy of solitude, we must make an important distinction that Nietzsche himself understood clearly: the difference between solitude and loneliness. Loneliness is an unwanted condition. It represents a failure of connection, a hunger for social bonds that remain unfulfilled. Loneliness is characterized by a sense of absence, of missing something essential. It is passive suffering. Solitude, by contrast, is chosen. It is not defined by the absence of others, but by the presence of oneself. Solitude is active, purposeful, and generative. It is not about what is missing, but about what can be created in the space that opens when we step away from social demands and expectations. In the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche's protagonist seeks solitude in the mountains for 10 years. This retreat is not an escape from humanity, but a necessary precondition for the development of wisdom that he will later bring back to humanity. Zarathustra says, "I am a wanderer and a mountain climber. I do not enjoy the plains, and it seems I cannot sit still for long, and whatever may yet come to me as fate and experience, wandering will be in it, and mountain climbing. In the final analysis, one experiences only oneself." For Nietzsche, true solitude is not merely the physical state of being alone, but an interior condition, a spiritual and psychological independence that allows one to stand apart from the crowd, to think beyond conventional wisdom, and to create values rather than merely inheriting them. One of Nietzsche's most famous concepts is that of the herd morality, the tendency of human beings to conform to social expectations and adopt collective values without question. This conformity, while providing comfort and belonging, comes at the cost of individual authenticity and greatness. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche writes, "The greater the state, the more petty, cowardly, and base is the individual. The collective wisdom of the herd will always be foolishness from the perspective of the exceptional individual." For Nietzsche, society exerts a powerful leveling influence. It rewards conformity and punishes deviation. It transforms unique individuals into interchangeable parts of a social machine. The last man that Nietzsche describes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the ultimate product of this social homogenization, a person who seeks only comfort, security, and consensus, who avoids all risk and challenge, who can no longer dream of transcendence. To resist this process of becoming merely another member of the herd, Nietzsche prescribes solitude. Only in solitude can we escape the constant pressure to conform. Only in solitude can we hear our own thoughts clearly, without the distorting influence of social approval or disapproval. As he writes in The Gay Science, "In solitude, the lonely one eats himself. In a crowd the many eat him. Now choose." This choice between social consumption and self-consumption is not an easy one. Self-consumption through solitude involves facing our own demons, confronting our deepest fears, and challenging our most cherished assumptions. It requires courage and honesty. But for Nietzsche, this difficult path of solitude is the only route to genuine self-knowledge and self-creation. It is the necessary condition for becoming what he called the Übermensch or Superman, not a physically superior being, but a person who has overcome the limitations of conventional thinking and created authentic values. In Nietzsche's philosophy, the ultimate goal of human existence is not happiness, comfort, or even knowledge for its own sake. It is what he calls self-overcoming, the continuous process of surpassing one's previous limitations and transforming oneself into something greater. This process of self-overcoming cannot happen within the confines of conventional society. It requires the space and freedom that only solitude can provide. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "I love him who seeks to create beyond himself, and thus perishes." This enigmatic statement points to the necessity of moving beyond our comfortable, familiar self, a process that is inherently painful and disorienting, like a kind of death, but that makes possible a rebirth into something greater. Solitude creates the conditions for this self-overcoming in several crucial ways. First, solitude allows us to hear our own voice. In the constant chatter of social life, we easily lose track of our own thoughts and desires. We begin to want what others want, to value what others value, to think what others think. Solitude creates a silence in which we can rediscover our unique perspective. Second, solitude forces us to confront ourselves without distraction. In social settings, we can always avoid uncomfortable truths about ourselves by redirecting our attention outward. In solitude, we have nowhere to hide from ourselves. We must face our own contradictions, weaknesses, and fears directly. Third, solitude liberates us from external judgment. Innovation and creativity require experimentation, which inevitably involves failure. In social contexts, the fear of judgment often prevents us from taking the risks necessary for growth. Solitude provides a protected space for trial and error. Fourth, solitude cultivates intellectual independence. Nietzsche was deeply suspicious of truths that were accepted simply because everyone believed them. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "The surest way to corrupt a youth is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently." Solitude helps us develop the capacity to evaluate ideas on their merits rather than their popularity. While Nietzsche championed solitude as the path to greatness, he was far from naive about its difficulties and dangers. Indeed, he experienced these challenges firsthand throughout his life. In Human, All Too Human, he acknowledges, "To live alone, one must be a beast or a god," says Aristotle. Leaving out the third case, one must be both, a philosopher. This statement recognizes that solitude places extraordinary demands on the individual. It requires both animal strength, the capacity to endure hardship, to rely on oneself to survive without the support that community provides, and divine perspective, the ability to see beyond immediate needs and concerns to larger truths. Nietzsche identified several specific dangers that await those who venture into profound solitude. First, there is the risk of madness. Without the reality-testing function that social interaction provides, our thoughts can spiral into delusion. It is perhaps ironic that Nietzsche himself ultimately succumbed to mental illness, spending the last decade of his life in a state of profound cognitive deterioration. While the exact cause of his condition remains debated, syphilis being a leading theory, his experience serves as a warning about the fine line between genius and madness that solitude can expose. Second, there is the danger of despair. Confronting the fundamental questions of existence without the comforting illusions that society provides can lead to a sense of nihilism, the feeling that life has no inherent meaning or purpose. Nietzsche himself wrestled intensely with nihilism, eventually proposing that the response to this abyss of meaninglessness is not to discover meaning, but to create it. Third, there is the challenge of returning to society. Those who have experienced profound solitude often find it difficult to reintegrate into normal social functioning. This is the predicament of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, who, after 10 years in the mountains, descends to share his wisdom, but finds that people are not ready to hear it. Despite these dangers, Nietzsche maintained that for certain individuals, those with the potential for greatness, the risks of solitude were worth taking. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, every profound spirit needs a mask. Even more, around every profound spirit, a mask is continuously growing. This mask is the face we present to society upon our return from solitude. It is not necessarily deceptive but protective, both of ourselves and of others, who may not be ready for the full force of the insights that solitude has revealed to us. Nietzsche's philosophy of solitude speaks to us with particular force in our contemporary situation. We live in an age of unprecedented connectivity, where digital technology has made it possible to be in constant contact with others. Social media platforms have transformed the experience of being alone, making it seem abnormal or even pathological. Yet, despite or perhaps because of this hyperconnectivity, many people report feeling more isolated than ever. This paradox would not have surprised Nietzsche, who understood that true connection is not measured by quantity, but by quality, not by constant contact, but by genuine understanding. In our digital age, Nietzsche's distinction between solitude and loneliness becomes even more crucial. Many of us experience not true solitude, a chosen state of productive aloneness, but a kind of crowded loneliness where we are constantly connected to others but rarely deeply engaged. The philosopher would likely view our contemporary aversion to being alone as a symptom of what he called the last man, the person who cannot bear their own company, who needs constant distraction and validation from others, who has lost the capacity for genuine solitude. Yet Nietzsche would also see, in our situation, a potential for renewed appreciation of solitude. As the costs of constant connectivity become more apparent, decreased attention spans, increased anxiety, the homogenization of thought, the value of stepping away from the digital crowd grows clearer. For those seeking to apply Nietzsche's insights to modern life, several principles emerge. First, create boundaries between yourself and the constant demands of digital connection. Intentional periods of digital silence can create the space necessary for original thought. Second, distinguish between information and wisdom. We are drowning in the former while starving for the latter. Information is acquired socially. Wisdom requires solitary reflection. Third, cultivate comfort with your own company. The capacity to be alone without distraction is a skill that requires practice, especially in our stimulation-rich environment. Fourth, recognize that the path to genuine individuality still requires stepping away from the crowd, even or especially when that crowd exists in virtual space. For Nietzsche, solitude was not merely a philosophical concept, but a lived reality that fueled his creative work. During his most isolated years, wandering through European pension houses and living on a modest disability pension, he produced works of extraordinary originality and power. In Ecce Homo, his autobiographical work, Nietzsche reflected on this connection between solitude and creativity. For art to exist, for any sort of aesthetic activity or perception to exist, a certain physiological precondition is indispensable: intoxication. This intoxication was not primarily chemical but psychological, a state of heightened perception and creative energy that solitude helped to foster. Without the constant demands of social life draining his limited physical energy, Nietzsche could direct his full intellectual force toward his work. For Nietzsche, creative solitude involves a particular quality of attention, a deep listening both to oneself and to the world. It is not about cutting oneself off entirely, but about creating the conditions for a different kind of receptivity. As he wrote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "One must learn to listen, as also one must learn to speak. For to whom would I like to speak? Indeed, to one who is asleep I will not give up my thoughts, and even the lectures that I give to my most eager ones sound asleep. How would the idle idlers be able to hearken to me?" True creativity for Nietzsche emerges from this state of awakened solitude. It is not about producing what others expect or what the market demands, but about bringing into being something genuinely new, something that could not have emerged within the confines of conventional thinking. This connection between solitude and creativity extends beyond Nietzsche's own experience. Many of history's greatest creative minds, from Leonardo da Vinci to Emily Dickinson, have required periods of intense solitude to produce their most significant work. In our age of collaboration and constant communication, Nietzsche reminds us that certain forms of creation still require the deep well of solitude, time alone with one's thoughts, free from external expectations and judgments. A common misunderstanding of Nietzsche's philosophy of solitude is to see it merely as a retreat from the difficulties of social life, a kind of escapism. Nothing could be further from Nietzsche's intention. For Nietzsche, solitude is not an escape, but an engagement, not a withdrawal from life's challenges, but a more direct confrontation with them. In The Gay Science, he writes, "I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who make things beautiful." This aesthetic affirmation of necessity, what Nietzsche calls amor fati, or love of fate, is cultivated through solitude. Only by stepping away from social distractions can we develop the strength to embrace life in its entirety, including its suffering and challenges. Solitude, properly understood, is not passive but active, not an empty absence but a full presence. It is a practice that requires discipline, courage, and commitment. As a practice, Nietzschean solitude involves several key elements. First, it requires physical distance. While inner solitude is ultimately more important than outer solitude, Nietzsche recognized that physical separation from others often facilitates psychological independence. Second, it demands honesty. The value of solitude is lost if we use it merely to reinforce our comfortable illusions about ourselves and the world. Productive solitude involves ruthless self-examination. Third, it necessitates creativity. Solitude is not merely about discovering who we are, but about actively creating ourselves. As Nietzsche famously stated, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. Fourth, it encompasses return. Unlike the hermit who seeks permanent separation from society, Nietzsche's ideal is more like Zarathustra, one who retreats into solitude to gain wisdom and strength, then returns to engage with the world from a position of greater authenticity and power. As we conclude our exploration of Nietzsche's philosophy of solitude, we return to a fundamental question. Why is solitude so difficult for many of us to embrace? For Nietzsche, the answer is clear. Solitude requires courage. It demands that we face ourselves without the comforting distractions of social validation. It asks us to stand alone, to think independently, to create rather than merely consume. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche writes, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." This is the paradox of the path of solitude. It leads to heights that make us incomprehensible, to those who remain within the safety of the crowd. Yet for those with the courage to embrace it, solitude offers rewards that no social acclaim can match: intellectual independence, creative power, authentic self-knowledge, and the opportunity to transcend conventional limitations. Nietzsche's final message about solitude might be summarized in these words from The Gay Science. The secret for harvesting from existence, the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius, send your ships into uncharted seas, live at war with your peers and yourselves. This dangerous living that Nietzsche advocates begins with the courage to be alone, to separate ourselves from the comfortable consensus of the herd, to think thoughts that have not been thought before, to create values rather than merely inheriting them. In our hyper-connected age, where the pressure to remain constantly engaged with others has never been stronger, Nietzsche's philosophy of solitude offers a powerful counterpoint, a reminder that greatness still requires the capacity to stand apart, to hear one's own voice, and to follow one's own path. The lesson of Nietzsche's life and philosophy is clear. Those who would achieve greatness must first master solitude, not as an escape, but as a forge in which a stronger, more authentic self can be created, not as a retreat from life, but as a more profound engagement with it, not as an end in itself, but as a necessary means to self-overcoming. In the final analysis, as Nietzsche himself discovered, one experiences only oneself. The courage to embrace this fact, to turn toward rather than away from solitude, may indeed be the most powerful lesson for those who seek to achieve true greatness.